Namaste. Hello everyone. Welcome to the NPTEL course Role of Craft and Technology in Interior Architecture. Today we will be discussing module number 31 and we will talk about the continuity and revival of crafts with a specific focus on the research and documentation perspective. So we will be emphasizing on the research and documentation perspective today, like I said, and we will see some examples and discussions, and there would be a little bit of discussion on a framework proposed by UNESCO, which again highlights the importance of research and documentation, archiving. We will see some of the work done by the DICRC CEPT University and some work done by IIT Roorkee, which focuses on the research and documentation perspective. So to begin with, just to understand what do the terms like craft revival, innovation, social change, what do they imply? Let us just have a brief look at some of these perspectives and definitions which have already been recorded by the researchers. So craft revival, it refers to the revitalization or rebirth of the craft, which may be in the state of decay or extinction because of varied reasons, such as lack of technology, not meeting the contemporary market and its demands, constant upgradation missing in the product range, method and process involved not improved or not upgraded, and lack of awareness for policy incentives and government schemes. So all of these could be the reasons for the extinction or decay of a craft, and to revive, it's very important that all of these aspects are looked at and understood and considered. But when we talk about the craft revival, something that goes hand in hand is also the mention of innovation, about which we will discuss in detail in the subsequent module. But just to put things in perspective, and while we are talking about the craft revival, also understand what does innovation mean in this context. So innovation deals with the upgradation of tools and machines, enhancement in the methods and processes of working, and the value addition in the existing products. While we are talking about the revival of craft and the innovation that needs to be embedded, let's also look at what does social change, what does it mean? So social change implies sustenance of the craft cluster, better work efficiency, increased production, better income, and improved standards of living for the craft persons. It was important to mention all these three in one slide because they have interlinkages, they are connected, and if we are to revive the crafts in a very sustainable way and which benefits the community, the craft community, then it is very important that we look at all of these three terms in a connected way. So in the beginning, I mentioned about a framework by UNESCO. So it's the framework for cultural statistic domains, and when we see here the mention of these important domains, the visual arts and crafts is also mentioned as an important domain, and what is highlighted further is the education and training perspective and the archiving and preserving perspective. So we are talking today about research and documentation, that also means archiving and disseminating, preserving, and we will also talk about the education and training perspective later. So this is to highlight that how important is to document the already existing art craft forms, interior architecture forms, and then to look forward to the value addition, to the kind of innovation which is very relevant for the community and the cluster, and which is also very important for India as a country to retain its identity, and to come up with sort of innovation which leads the way, which generates employment and better standards of living, and which prevents a certain art craft interior architecture form to decay or languish. So this is the focus and the importance over here. We will also see some of the works done by the DICRC again, and then how they focus on the research and documentation perspective. So they have this institutional framework of actions and a modus operandi where they highlight these important aspects. So identify, collaborate, interact, record, investigate, analyze, expose, ideate, create, evaluate, disseminate and connect. And that's how they work with the craft clusters and the communities. Further, just to briefly give an overview of what each of these aspects mean and how they have defined it. So, to identify current scenarios and needs in the context of craft, to create and develop collaborations involving various organizations and individuals, interact, to initiate interaction through demonstrations and discussions, to develop various documentation methods, to understand the craft and craft practice in depth. So, while we are focusing on recording the craft practices, it is also very important to develop the documentation methods. How an appropriate way could be found or an approach could be employed so that a proper documentation could be done. Investigate, to inquire about current scenarios of specific craft and craft practices and related design issues. So, connecting craft with design and talking about the craft design collaborations, investigating the links between them. Analyze, to generate an understanding and develop new perspective on building crafts through empirical knowledge. So, building crafts is important here, about which we have been talking, and empirical knowledge, of course, that craft is associated with, the knowledge that is transferred from one generation to another, and how could be a relevant way adopted to analyze them in that particular context, that the empirical knowledge gets highlighted and the building crafts get significance. Further, expose, to provide exposure to the craftspersons and designers about craft through varied sessions and site visits. Ideate, to brainstorm possible ideas to initiate innovation through craft design process. So, there is this craft design process where craftspersons, designers, they work together, they understand the different nuances associated with the craft and design and how they are not seen as isolated domains today. Create, to create effective new products, prototypes, modules through a rigorous amalgamation of craft and design. Evaluate, to assess and evaluate the activities and events to generate the in-depth insight for the future of crafts. Disseminate, to share the knowledge and exchange information through various activities and means. And last but not the least, connect, to connect craftspersons and professionals through multiple initiatives to bridge the gap between craft and design. So, this is their larger umbrella institutional framework of actions, and then within that also there are different activities like research and documentation, innovation and development, resource building, dissemination. For that also they have varied models and methods. So, while we are talking about research and documentation, the model of research that is followed is visually and schematically shown here. So, first of all a survey is carried and then the mapping is done, then the documentation, analysis and resource building. So, it is a step by step process, and then they have certain key projects highlighting the research and documentation perspective. So, there are some visual slides which I am just going to browse through, and it would just help us understand the process of research and documentation and how significant it is and how efficiently it has been developed by different organizations and examples that I am discussing here. So, here we see the focus on survey, and it is for identifying mapping, identifying. So, the kinds of maps that are developed and recording through mobile apps and discussions, talking to the community and visiting their own community, their houses, reaching out to them. Then again mapping, like we were talking about the mobile app. So, again there is an application and this is the map on which the data is recorded, and all the details are recorded digitally as well. and this is the kind of inventory that gets generated, which is online and it's there on their portal. So again, what kind of tools do we adopt? You know, before deciding to do the documentation, to do the research, it's very important that there is a sort of a framework in hand. There are certain tools which are identified, how the documentation will be carried, so that it is done very efficiently on the site. And there are certain kinds of applications which get developed, and then the entire dissemination happens through an online portal which could be accessed through, you know, varied people, even the craft persons. So that's the entire process, and the kind of institutional framework which is envisioned before doing this, it quite helps on the site. Documentation. So again, documenting the cluster, documenting the entire process through photography as a tool, interviewing, sketching, measurements, you know, all those kinds of documentation, and then coming up with certain kinds of booklets and monographs so that it's also disseminated and it's there as a repository, as a documented record. Analysis. So there are also certain kinds of activities which lead to analysis. There is certain kind of framework. So SWOT analysis is what we see here on the slide, and which focuses on certain important aspects, while the documentation of craft cluster is in the focus. So products, infrastructure, raw material, technology, human resource, quality, markets, energy and environment, information and communication technology. So while analyzing and while doing this SWOT analysis, and there could be varied kinds of analysis which different organizations adopt. So again, there's a method to that, and then how are they recorded and documented? That's again another way of creating a repository. Resource building. So it's very important that once the research and documentation is done, the mapping is done, it's important that, you know, there is a sort of a resource hub where these important documents could be accessed and they could benefit other people and further research could be carried on. So there is this very important resource building component within the gamut of research and documentation, and we would have another module which will specifically focus only on the resource building component. So again, here we see this building craft lab where, you know, it could be found on the DICRC website, the online portal which they have, the website that they have developed. And under this section of building craft lab, there is this research documentation done and the resource building component taken care of. So data is available, and a lot of people could connect and reach out to the craft persons in clusters, and further craft design processes could be undertaken. Again, the resource building part, so we see a lot of different manuals and booklets and different plates and papers focusing on the different kinds of projects which involve research and documentation related to craft clusters in Gujarat and other places also, which DICRC has done. And then they have put all of this on their website and they are accessible to everyone. Further, for the documentation also, there is this model that has been adopted. So again, there is a field visit which is followed subsequently by the mapping, then the documentation is carried, analysis is done, and finally a resource hub is created. So the resource building component is taken care of. So just seeing the model of documentation and the step-by-step process that is adopted. So field visit, identifying, you know, the potential areas where the field visits need to be done, the kind of clusters which are identified, so that, you know, or you could say the case studies which are identified, so that the team of researchers could go there and do the research and documentation, and interacting with them on site, visual observations, and then further documentation. So again, we see here the building craft lab and the mapping component which has been addressed, and we see all these different kinds of plates and digital recordings that have been mapped and put over here for further references. Some examples, very visual with a brief information. So documentation, again, it continues, field drawings, further refinement, mapping on the site. They are my friends. This is Neha and this is Rajdeep. I have worked with them and they have been doing this research and documentation as a team since a very long time. And then of course, like we always emphasize on the technical drawings, basic drawings and then the technically refined ones, which are also properly, composed with all the information and details. Then analysis, some kind of brainstorming and analysis, and establishing connections and what are the different parts and the intention behind a particular craft process and things like that. Also, like this very interesting traditional piece of furniture, it is analyzed in terms of its different components and which component came first and how it was assembled and details like that. And then of course the resource building, so the different digital plates and the portfolios that have been created. Just like we keep referring to the Jaipur portfolio for different kinds of drawings and the different kinds of cataloging that is done related to the furniture craft. The same way the different organizations like DICRC and IIT Roorkee and many others, they are also creating digital portfolios and as part of their projects, and they have been considered as important resources and repository. So now we'll see some works done by IIT Roorkee and how do they do the research and documentation. So specifically the focus for today's lecture is the project Dharohar under Ministry of Culture and how it is done. So starting from the field visits, mapping and developing the route maps, then the further process is taken. So again, identifying the potential areas for field visit and the kind of route which is adopted, what are the kinds of clusters that need to be approached, and creating a sort of prior framework before going on the site and developing these very interesting route maps. They have been developed by Debashish and it's a very interesting piece of work. Again, some more examples, identifying the cases for field visit and the different kinds of clusters, then the institutional support that could be achieved, different resource persons that could be approached, again the clusters that have been identified, the kind of art and craft form that have been identified, and also the surrounding places of importance, and again where the material culture is prominent, and then trying to link all of these and trying to create a route map and then just going and working there with the research and documentation perspective, followed by surveys, interviews and focus group discussions. So once the field visits are identified, I mean the case studies, and once the team is on the field, then the different kinds of interviews and surveys that are conducted. So the profile of craft persons is mapped, a basic information about them, their family, the workshop, the kind of work they have been doing, which generation do they belong to, and the important aspects of the craft and the craft process. And then there are other sheets where the different set of information could be collected. So again here, which cluster do they belong to, and some more additional piece of information, just talking to them and recording whatever information gets generated and shared by them. Some more information here. And here this is the slide which focuses on the different interviews that get conducted on the site. So different stakeholders, different individuals, different organizations who could be important in connecting us to the craft and the craft clusters and getting us some sort of support in building the repo and going on the site and working with the actual craft communities, staying with them, learning from them. So while this research and documentation is carried on and the focus group discussions and surveys happen, the information like this gets generated, which is very important. So the list of craft persons identified in a particular region associated with a particular art or craft form. Again, some important piece of information, list of craft clusters which are covered under a particular scheme, and further the list of craft clusters covered, and we get some sort of an idea, So this project Dharohar, it majorly focuses on woodwork and Kumaon, and how these are identified as priority sectors and how government is already working in them. So these kinds of sets of data and information, they help strengthen the relevance of the study and also help in adopting a proper research and documentation approach. Some more information. So this is the list of craft persons which is identified by IIT Roorkee while working on this project and carrying different participatory workshops and also certain national seminars. And again, some focus group discussions and how do they benefit, and some information that comes out of these discussions and interviews. Then another important method that we at IIT Roorkee for this project have adopted is documenting visual narratives through sketches, illustrations and field observations. So there is a recording and documentation of narratives visually, and so weaving, something related to the food, and the women, their activities, the kind of utilitarian objects which are made by the women and then used for the day-to-day life, different kinds of narratives which are very visually documented. Then also the interior architecture. Again, we were talking about collaboration while we were discussing the DICRC model. So here also there is a very healthy collaboration. So all the illustrations and sketches are done by a good friend of mine, Sham. Then there is another student, Excellent, who has done a lot of sketches. So there are collaborations, there are small teams which work together. So again, the visual narratives here, how the apron is done by the women, and how it is so ceremonial. Then the entire process. So I was mentioning about our student. So entire process, also recording the process, how starting from the scratch and the entire process, and finally the apron art is done. Again, the process here, recording that through visual narratives and creating visual repositories. Further, these are all related to the apron art. This is related to the woodcraft, also the kinds of tools that go in the making. So these kinds of narratives, weaving, small sketches and illustrations, how it is done. So it's not the complete process here what we see on the slide, there are more plates to it, but I'm just giving a gist of how the visual narratives help in understanding the process, and of course for recording and creating this repository. This is for the copper craft. So all these visual narratives, this is for the ringal craft. Then of course identifying the case studies and mapping. So what are the specific houses to be visited while we are talking about the building crafts, and where are they situated, that kind of mapping also. Within that, identifying different elements, the doors, the windows, and here the threshold and the apron painting on that. So mapping that as well. Then the observations and the analysis part. So we see here different kinds of observations. What are the different motifs that have been observed and recorded? Where are they placed in the interior spaces? What level, eye level, above, on the wall, on the floor? All those kinds of observations, they are done. And then some kind of analysis is also done. So here we see some original motifs of apron in Kumaon, and then how we study them and try to relate what all is still seen. So that kind of analysis, which dynasty, which time period do they belong to, and how old are these, so even that kind of analysis. Then of course technical drawings, and then creating this portfolio. So a lot of technical drawings are created, whether it's a furniture element or it's the space in the interior architecture. Different kinds of drawings, again some local parlance also, how the particular elements are called locally. And then of course the resource building and dissemination part, which I have very briefly put here because we will be discussing about it later. So monographs and reports, and building also a sort of a network as a resource, calling the craft people to the institute, and then holding seminars and workshops, developing the craft bazaars and disseminating the knowledge. So all that. So again, now continuing with the continuity and revival of craft, we will be focusing on the education and training perspective in the next module, and we will take this discussion further. Some references now. So some important references while we are talking about these different perspectives related to the continuity and revival of the craft, and the other ones which are consolidated from the previous discussions as well. Thank you.